In the spring of 1853, 5 men stood at the base of something that shouldn't exist. They tilted their heads back and kept tilting until their necks ached and their hats fell off. The trunk in front of them was wider than a house. The bark alone was 2 feet thick, soft and fibrous, like compressed rope. And the top of this thing, this impossible column of living wood, disappeared into the California sky somewhere around 300 feet above their heads. Augustus T. Dowd, the hunter who'd stumbled onto this grove while chasing a wounded grizzly, had tried to tell people back in Murphy's camp what he'd found. Nobody believed him. They thought he'd been drinking. They thought the altitude had gotten to him. They thought he was running some kind of scam to lure miners away from their claims. So Dowd changed tactics. He told them he'd shot the biggest grizzly bear anyone had ever seen, and would they like to come take a look? 20 men followed him into the Sierra Nevada mountains that day. And when they reached this clearing in Calaveras County, when they saw what was actually standing there, several of them dropped to their knees. One man reportedly wept. They weren't looking at the biggest tree in California. They were looking at the largest tree ever recorded in human history. The Discovery Tree, as it would come to be called, measured 302 feet tall. Its base stretched 32 feet across, with a circumference of 96 feet. And when botanists finally calculated its age by counting the rings, they realized this single organism had been alive for somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years. This tree was a seedling when the Roman Republic was young. It survived the fall of Rome, the Dark Ages, the Renaissance, and the birth of every nation that existed in 1853. It had been growing in this grove, adding ring after ring, century after century, through the rise and collapse of civilizations that never knew it existed. And within 2 years of its discovery, it would be dead. Not from disease, not from fire, not from any natural cause. This tree, the largest living thing anyone had ever documented, would be cut down by men with hand tools. And the story of how they did it, and why they did it, and what it cost them, tells you everything you need to know about a specific moment in American history when we decided that nothing on this continent was too big, too old, or too sacred to be turned into money. This is the story of the Discovery Tree, and it begins with a question that nobody in 1853 thought to ask. Just because you can cut something down, does that mean you should? The California that Augustus Dowd wandered into in the early 1850s was not the California you know. The gold rush had transformed a distant Mexican territory into the fastest growing region on Earth. In 1848, roughly 15,000 non-native people lived in all of California. By 1852, that number had exploded to over 250,000. By 1860, it would reach nearly 400,000. These weren't settlers in any traditional sense. They were prospectors, merchants, gamblers, and fortune seekers who had abandoned farms in Ohio, fishing boats in Massachusetts, and factory jobs in New York to chase the promise of instant wealth. They crossed the continent in wagon trains that took 6 months. They sailed around Cape Horn on voyages that took longer. Some of them walked from Missouri to Sacramento, burying friends along the way, and most of them found nothing but disappointment. The easy surface gold was gone within the first 2 years. The nuggets that men had plucked from stream beds in 1848 were now just stories told in saloons. What remained required capital, equipment, and labor that individual miners couldn't provide. So 250,000 restless men scattered across the Sierra Nevada foothills, looking for the next opportunity. Some turned to hydraulic mining, which involved blasting entire hillsides with high-pressure water cannons, washing away mountains to find the gold buried inside. Others turned to crime. The murder rate in Gold Rush, California, was higher than anywhere else in American history. And some, like Augustus Dowd, turned to hunting. The mining camps needed meat, and a skilled hunter could make a decent living supplying it. The California lumber industry in 1853 was in its infancy, but growing fast. The mining camps needed timber for sluice boxes, mine shafts, and the ramshackle buildings that passed for towns. San Francisco, destroyed by fire 6 times in the first 2 years of the gold rush, had an insatiable appetite for construction materials. and the great forests of the Sierra Nevada seemed inexhaustible. Steam-powered sawmills were already operating in the foothills, processing pine and fir into boards that sold for prices that would have seemed insane anywhere else in America. 1,000 board feet of lumber that cost $2 in the Midwest fetched $100 in Sacramento. The men who owned those sawmills became rich. The men who worked in them made enough to keep chasing their golden dreams. Into this world of frantic extraction and easy fortunes, Augustus Dowd brought news of trees that dwarfed anything anyone had ever seen. Dowd was tracking a grizzly bear in the spring of 1852 when he entered the grove that would change everything. He'd been following the wounded animal for hours, pushing deeper into the mountains than he'd intended, when the forest around him began to change. The normal pine and fir gave way to something different, something impossible. The trunks he was walking between were the color of cinnamon, covered in bark that looked soft and fibrous, like shredded rope. They rose straight up without branches for 100 feet or more before the first limbs appeared, and when Dowd stopped to look around, really look, he realized he was standing among giants. The trees Dowd had discovered were Sequoia dendron giganteum, a species that exists nowhere else on Earth except a narrow band of the western Sierra Nevada between 5,000 and 7,000 feet of elevation. We call them giant sequoias now, though in the 1850s they went by several names: Sierra redwoods, big trees, mammoth trees, and for a brief period, Washingtonia gigantea. What makes giant sequoias different from other large trees isn't just their height. Coast redwoods, their cousins to the west, can grow taller. Douglas firs can reach impressive heights as well. What makes giant sequoias unique is their sheer mass. They don't just grow up, they grow out. A mature giant sequoia can have a trunk diameter of 30 feet or more, with branches that are themselves larger than most trees. By volume, they are the largest living organisms on the planet, and possibly the largest living organisms that have ever existed. The Miwok people had lived among these trees for thousands of years before any European saw them. They called them Wawona, a word that roughly translates to big tree, and they incorporated the groves into their seasonal movements and spiritual practices. The sequoia groves were sacred places. The Miwok didn't cut the big trees, didn't burn them, didn't do anything to harm them. They simply lived alongside them, generation after generation, as the trees grew imperceptibly larger. But the Miwok were being systematically displaced and killed by the wave of white settlement that followed the gold rush. The California legislature had passed the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians in 1850, which, despite its name, effectively legalized the kidnapping of Native children and the forced labor of Native adults. Militia groups conducted raids on villages throughout the Sierra Nevada. Disease swept through communities that had no immunity to European illnesses. By the time Augustus Dowd stumbled into the Calaveras Grove, the Miwok people who had protected these trees were scattered, dying, and powerless to prevent what was about to happen. When Dowd brought those 20 men from Murphy's camp to see the discovery tree, he wasn't just showing them a natural wonder, he was showing them an opportunity. These men had come to California to get rich. Most of them had failed at mining. But even a failed miner could recognize that something this extraordinary had value. The question was how to extract it. You need to understand the scale of what these men were looking at, because the numbers alone don't convey it. The discovery tree had a circumference of 96 feet at its base. Picture a circle 96 feet around, and then picture a tree trunk filling that entire space. If you and 20 of your friends joined hands and tried to circle the trunk, you wouldn't make it. You'd need at least 25 people, probably 30, to form a complete ring. The lowest branches started about 130 feet above the ground. That's higher than a 10-story building. The branches themselves were 6 to 8 feet in diameter, so larger than most trees you've ever seen. And those branches spread outward in a crown that covered nearly an acre of forest floor in shade. The tree was estimated to contain over 1 million board feet of lumber. 1 million board feet. That's enough to build 70 average-sized houses. That's enough lumber to stretch, if laid end to end, for nearly 200 miles, all contained in a single living organism. But here's the thing about giant sequoias that the men of 1853 didn't fully understand yet. The wood is almost worthless. Sequoia wood is brittle. The cellular structure that makes these trees so massive also makes the wood prone to shattering on impact. When a giant sequoia falls, either naturally or by human action, the trunk tends to explode into fragments. And the concussive force of all that weight hitting the ground travels through the wood faster than the wood can flex, and the result is more like a bomb going off than a tree falling down. The wood that survives is soft, prone to splitting, and lacks the structural integrity that makes pine and fir valuable for construction. You can use it for fence posts, grape stakes, shingles, and matchsticks. You cannot use it to build anything that matters. The very qualities that allowed these trees to grow so large, the lightness and air pockets in the cellular structure, made them useless for the purposes that justified cutting down normal trees. This was a tree that had survived for 3,000 years, that had witnessed the entire span of recorded human history, and its primary commercial value was matchsticks. But the men standing in Calaveras Grove weren't thinking about lumber. They were thinking about something more valuable in the attention economy of 1853: spectacle. The first scheme came from a man named George Gale, who saw the discovery tree not as raw material, but as an attraction. This was the era of P.T. Barnum, of traveling curiosity shows, of people paying good money to see mummies and monsters, and anything that defied the ordinary. If Americans would pay to see a two-headed calf or a fake mermaid, imagine what they'd pay to see proof of the largest tree ever recorded. The problem was logistics. You couldn't bring the tree to the people. It was too big, too remote, too difficult to transport in any form that preserved its impressive dimensions. But maybe, Gale figured, you could bring part of it. Strip the bark, hollow out a section of the trunk, ship the whole thing to the East Coast and Europe as a traveling exhibit. People would pay admission to walk through the hollow trunk, marvel at the cross-section of rings, and count the centuries. The plan required killing the tree. Gale knew this. Everyone knew this. And nobody, as far as the historical record shows, raised any objection. To accomplish this, Gale assembled a crew of roughly 25 men. These were miners mostly, failed prospectors looking for steady pay, the kind of men who had crossed continents and oceans for a chance at wealth, and wound up doing manual labor in the mountains. Their names have mostly been lost to history, which is a shame. They deserve to be remembered for what they accomplished, even if what they accomplished was destruction. Where Gale purchased a battery of pump augers, which are drilling tools designed to bore holes into wood. The augers were about 3 inches in diameter, with spiral flutes that pulled sawdust out of the hole as the drill advanced. In normal circumstances, they were used to hollow out water pipes and pump housings. They had never been used for anything like this. The crew established a camp near the grove in the late spring of 1853. They built temporary shelters, laid in supplies, and prepared their tools. And then they began the process of killing something that had been alive since before the birth of Christ. The work started with the bark. Giant sequoia bark can be 2 feet thick at the base, and it strips off in fibrous sheets that reveal the pinkish red wood beneath. The bark is fire resistant, which is one reason these trees survive for so long. It's also surprisingly light, with air pockets that make it easy to tear once you get an edge started. Gale's crew used scaffolding to climb the trunk, peeling the bark in sections that they labeled for later reassembly. They worked with pry bars and axes, wedging tools behind the bark and levering outward until sheets the size of wagon beds came free. Each section was numbered and cataloged, the beginning of a puzzle they planned to reassemble thousands of miles away. This process alone took weeks. The bark went up 100 feet or more, and every foot had to be stripped, lowered to the ground, and prepared for transport. The work was tedious and dangerous. A man on scaffolding could easily fall. A sheet of bark weighing hundreds of pounds could easily crush someone if it came free unexpectedly. But as far as the records show, nobody was seriously hurt during this phase. Then came the actual felling. And this is where the story becomes an engineering puzzle that's hard to fully appreciate unless you've tried to cut something large. A normal tree, even a large one, can be felled with axes and crosscut saws. You cut a notch on one side to direct the fall, called the undercut, then saw through from the other side until gravity does the rest. A skilled team of loggers can drop a 6-foot diameter pine in a few hours. The whole process might take a day for a really big tree, maybe 2 for something exceptional. The discovery tree couldn't be felled this way. The trunk was too wide for any saw that existed in 1853. The largest crosscut saws of the era were maybe 12 feet long. The discovery tree was 32 feet in diameter. You'd need a saw almost 3 times longer than anything that had ever been made, and you'd need scaffolding to support it, and you'd need a team of men strong enough to pull that impossible blade back and forth for days on end. Axes weren't a realistic option either. A man with an axe working steadily might cut through a few inches of wood per hour. At that rate, cutting through 32 feet of trunk would take months. The wood would begin to rot before you could finish the cut. And axe work is exhausting. No crew could maintain that kind of effort for the time required. So Gale's crew used the pump augers to drill holes around the entire circumference of the trunk. The plan was elegant in its brutality. Instead of cutting through the wood, they would perforate it. Drill enough holes close enough together, and the remaining wood between them would be too weak to support the tree's weight. 25 men working in rotating shifts, each team operating large hand-powered drills, boring into the base of a tree that was already ancient when their ancestors were living in mud huts. The auger holes were drilled close together, maybe 6 inches apart, creating a perforated line around the entire 96-foot circumference. The work was monotonous and grinding. A pump auger requires 2 men to operate, 1 to turn the handle, and 1 to maintain downward pressure on the bit. The rhythm was hypnotic. Push, turn, while the bit chewed slowly through the wood, maybe an inch or 2 per minute in soft sequoia. Less when you hit a knot or a patch of harder growth. Each hole had to penetrate deep enough to reach the heartwood, at least 2 feet into the trunk. The men worked dawn to dusk, 6 days a week. Their hands blistered and bled during the first few days, then calloused over into thick pads of hardened skin. Their shoulders ached from the constant rotational effort. Their backs screamed from holding the augers steady against the resistance of 3,000-year-old wood. At night, they collapsed into their bunks and slept like the dead. The smell of sequoia wood is distinctive, sweet and slightly spicy, like a mixture of cedar and nutmeg. After a few days of drilling, that smell permeated everything. The men's clothes reeked of it. Their hair was full of red sawdust. When they ate their evening meals, the taste of sequoia was in their food. On Sundays, they rested, though some of them reportedly walked into the grove just to look at their progress, to count the holes and calculate how many remained. 1,000 holes in total, give or take, 96 feet of circumference, holes every 6 inches. You could do the math if you cared to. Most of the men didn't care. They wanted to finish the job, collect their pay, and move on to whatever opportunity came next. The sound of drilling echoed through the forest constantly, a grinding mechanical whine that scattered the birds and silenced the usual sounds of the mountain wilderness. Wildlife fled the grove. Even the squirrels, which had probably lived in these trees for generations, disappeared. The only sounds were the augers, the men's voices, and the occasional crack of branch falling somewhere in the canopy above. The drilling took 22 days. Nearly 1,000 holes, bored by hand, each one requiring hours of grinding labor. The men developed calluses on their calluses. Their shoulders ached from the constant rotational effort. Their clothes became saturated with sawdust that worked its way into every fold and seam. And when they were finished, the tree was still standing. The holes alone weren't enough to bring it down. The remaining wood between the holes, those 6-inch strips of ancient growth, was still strong enough to support 300 feet of trunk and branches. The tree had survived for 3 millennia. It wasn't going to fall without a fight. So they brought in wedges. Massive iron wedges, some of them a foot long and an inch and a half thick, designed to be hammered into tight spaces and split wood apart. The crew drove wedges into the bore holes, 2 or 3 per hole, and beat them with heavy mauls until the wood between the holes began to crack. Day after day, the ring of iron on iron echoed through the grove. The men worked in teams, leapfrogging around the circumference, driving wedges and moving on while others came behind to drive them deeper. The cracks spread. Wood fibers that had grown together for centuries began to separate, and still the tree stood. On the morning of the 23rd day, a Sunday, the crew arrived to find that something had changed. There was no wind. The grove was perfectly still. But the discovery tree was trembling. The vibrations were invisible at first, just a feeling in the ground that made the men uneasy. Where then someone noticed that the top of the tree, 300 feet above their heads, had begun to sway. Very slightly, almost imperceptibly, but definitely moving, even though there was no breeze. The foreman ordered everyone clear of the fall zone, which was easier said than done because nobody knew which direction 300 feet of ancient wood was going to come down. The undercut technique that loggers use to control the fall of normal trees didn't apply here. They hadn't cut a notch, they'd perforated the entire circumference evenly. The tree could fall in any direction, depending on which section of remaining wood gave way first. The crew scattered into the surrounding forest, some of them climbing hills for a better view, others hiding behind the massive trunks of neighboring sequoias. They watched, they waited, and some of them reportedly prayed, others took bets on the direction of the fall. For nearly 2 hours, nothing happened. The tree swayed. The trembling continued. Birds fled the grove, their alarm calls fading into the distance. And the men watched from their hiding places, unable to look away, unwilling to leave. Then, around 10 in the morning, the discovery tree began to move. The sound, according to witnesses, was unlike anything they'd heard before. It started as a groan, deep and resonant, like the earth itself was protesting. The remaining wood fibers stretched and snapped, one by one at first, then in clusters, then in an avalanche of breaking bonds that accelerated faster than the ear could track. Then came the crack of splitting wood, loud enough to be heard miles away. The trunk tilted slowly at first, almost gracefully, then faster, picking up momentum as 3,000 years of growth surrendered to gravity. The fall took about 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, the tree that had witnessed the entire span of human civilization rotated from vertical to horizontal, covering an arc of 90 degrees, while its crown, an acre of branches and foliage, swept through the air like a giant's fist. When it hit the ground, the impact was felt in Murphy's camp, 5 miles away. Windows rattled in their frames. Horses broke free from their hitches and bolted. One miner later claimed that his coffee cup jumped off the table and shattered on the floor. In the grove itself, the crash was so violent that the trunk shattered into 3 main sections, exactly as anyone who understood sequoia wood would have predicted. The impact threw debris hundreds of feet in all directions. A cloud of dust and bark fragments rose above the forest and drifted east on the wind. And when the echoes finally faded, the men emerged from their hiding places to survey what they had done. The discovery tree was dead. It had taken 23 days and the coordinated effort of 25 men, with the best tools available in 1853, to kill it. The stump they left behind was a flat oval, 32 feet across at its widest point, smooth where the auger holes had been drilled, and rough where the remaining wood had torn free. And now came the part that was supposed to make it all worthwhile. The crew spent the following weeks processing the remains. They stripped more bark from the fallen trunk, labeled each section, and prepared it for shipping. They cut a cross-section from the base, a round of wood 32 feet in diameter and 18 inches thick, weighing several tons. Extracting this single slice required building a road into the grove and dragging the round out on a specially constructed sled. They hollowed out a portion of the trunk large enough for a dance floor. The soft sequoia wood was easy to work, and within weeks, they had carved out a flat surface that could accommodate dozens of people standing or dancing. On July 4th, 1854, the citizens of Murphy's camp held a celebration on the stump of the discovery tree. 32 couples danced cotillions on the smooth-cut surface while a brass band played nearby. The stump was large enough that the musicians could stand in the center while the dancers circled around them. Newspaper correspondents from San Francisco attended. The event was reported across the country. The Sacramento Union called it a desecration. Other papers celebrated it as proof of American ingenuity and can-do spirit. The debate, such as it was, foreshadowed arguments that would echo through the next century and a half. The bark sections, meanwhile, were shipped to San Francisco, then loaded onto ships bound for the East Coast. The journey around Cape Horn took months. When the bark finally arrived in New York, it was transferred to another ship and sent to London, where it would be reassembled in the Crystal Palace, Prince Albert's great glass exhibition hall, for the wondering eyes of the British public. The cross-section went on tour as well. Displayed at agricultural fairs and expositions where people could count the rings and contemplate the passage of time. Curators drew lines across the surface marking significant dates: the birth of Christ, the fall of Rome, the Norman conquest, the discovery of America. Each ring represented a year, and there were nearly 3,000 of them to count. But here's the twist that none of the entrepreneurs anticipated. People didn't believe it. When British audiences saw the reassembled bark in London, many of them assumed it was a hoax. The dimensions were simply too large to accept. No tree could be that big, they reasoned. No tree could be that old. The whole thing must be some kind of American swindle, like Barnum's Fiji Mermaid or the exaggerated tales of Western plenty that European newspapers love to mock. The exhibition was a commercial failure. George Gale lost money, the investors lost money. The bark sat in the Crystal Palace, largely ignored, until the building burned down in 1866 and the remains of the Discovery Tree were destroyed for the second time. Back in California, the stump became a local curiosity. For decades, it hosted occasional dances and gatherings. People carved their names into the surface. Tourists posed for photographs. The tree that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations became a footnote in guidebooks, a roadside attraction for visitors who couldn't quite comprehend what they were standing on. Meanwhile, the rest of the Calaveras Grove faced its own assault. Inspired by the attention the Discovery Tree had received, other entrepreneurs arrived with their own schemes. The mother of the forest, she another ancient giant standing 130 feet tall, had its bark stripped for exhibition in 1854. Unlike the Discovery Tree, the mother wasn't cut down. The strippers worked their way up the trunk, peeling bark to a height of 116 feet, then left the naked tree standing. But stripping the bark had the same effect as cutting the tree down. Without that protective layer, the cambium underneath couldn't survive. It dried out, cracked, and died. The mother of the forest became a standing skeleton, a 130-foot monument to commercial short-sightedness. It stood that way for over a century, bleached white by sun and rain, before finally collapsing in the 1990s. By 1860, the Calaveras Grove had become a tourist destination in its own right. Hotels were built. Trails were cut, and stagecoaches brought visitors from Stockton and Sacramento. And people came from around the world to marvel at what remained of the ancient forest while standing on the stump of what had been destroyed. The irony was obvious to everyone, including the tourists themselves. They came to see giant trees because the giant trees were being destroyed. The destruction was the attraction, and the more trees that were cut, the more valuable the survivors became. The Discovery Tree held the record for the largest tree ever cut down for nearly a century. Other giant sequoias would be felled in the decades that followed, as lumber companies pushed deeper into the Sierra Nevada looking for timber that might actually be worth the effort. The Converse Basin, about 70 miles south of Calaveras, became the center of industrial-scale sequoia logging in the 1880s and 1890s. Companies built flumes and railroads to haul out the logs, and they cut trees that approached the size of the Discovery Tree, though none quite matched it. The General Noble tree, felled in 1892, measured 26 feet in diameter. It was cut into sections and shipped to the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, where it was reassembled as a house that visitors could walk through. Unlike the Discovery Tree bark, people believed the General Noble exhibit. They had 40 years of photographs and scientific documentation to prove giant sequoias were real. But even the General Noble was smaller than what had fallen in Calaveras Grove in 1853. The record mattered because it represented a kind of boundary. The discovery tree wasn't just the biggest sequoia cut down. It was, as far as anyone has been able to document, the largest individual tree of any species ever deliberately killed by humans. Larger trees exist today, protected by law. Larger trees may have fallen to natural causes, toppled by storms or undermined by floods. But no human being, with tools and intention, has ever cut down anything bigger than what George Gale's crew killed in 23 days. That record stands today, and it will likely stand forever. The trees that might have broken it are now inside national parks. The technology that might have made cutting them easier is now regulated by environmental law. The discovery tree's record is frozen in time, a monument to what we were willing to destroy before we learned to protect. What did we lose when that tree fell? The discovery tree was approximately 2,900 years old. Let's think about what that means in terms of human history. When this tree was a sapling, just a few inches tall and struggling for sunlight on the forest floor, the Greek alphabet was still being developed. The Phoenicians were spreading their maritime culture across the Mediterranean. The city of Rome wouldn't be founded for another 200 years. The Buddha hadn't been born. Confucius hadn't been born. The entire philosophical and religious foundation of human civilization was still in the future. By the time the tree was 100 years old, still young by sequoia standards, Alexander the Great was conquering Persia. By 500 years, the Roman Empire was at its height, and Jesus of Nazareth was walking the shores of Galilee. By 1,000 years, Rome had fallen, Christianity had spread across Europe, and the Tang Dynasty was flourishing in China. Every major event in recorded human history happened while this tree was alive. Every war you've ever studied, every peace treaty ever signed, every plague that swept across continents, and every renaissance that followed. The tree was standing in the Sierra Nevada when the Vikings landed in North America. It was standing when Marco Polo traveled to China. It was standing when the Black Death killed a third of Europe. It was standing when Columbus crossed the Atlantic, when the Reformation split Christianity, when Shakespeare wrote his plays. It was standing when the Declaration of Independence was signed, when the French Revolution transformed Europe, when Napoleon rose and fell. And it was standing when Augustus Dowd stumbled into the Grove in 1852, chasing a grizzly bear into immortality. Then, in 23 days, it was gone. The men who cut it down weren't villains. That's the part that's hard to accept from our modern perspective. They were people operating within a system that valued exploitation over preservation, immediate profit over long-term consequence. They saw the tree as a resource to be harvested, not a miracle to be protected. And by the values of their time and place, they weren't wrong. The California of 1853 was a place where everything was for sale. Land that had belonged to native peoples for millennia was being claimed, fenced, and developed. Mountains were being blasted apart for gold. Rivers were being dammed and diverted for agriculture. In that context, cutting down a big tree, when even the biggest tree, was just business. What changed wasn't the tree. What changed was us. The destruction of the discovery tree and the mother of the forest sparked what historians consider one of the first public conservation debates in American history. Newspapers that had initially celebrated the felling began publishing editorials questioning whether some things should be protected from commerce. Politicians in Washington started receiving letters asking what, if anything, could be done to prevent further destruction. Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect who would later design Central Park, visited the Calaveras Grove in 1864 and was moved to argue for federal protection of such places. His report to Congress helped build the case that certain landscapes were too valuable to be left to private exploitation. The debate was messy and slow, full of false starts and compromises, but it eventually led to real action. In 1864, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Yosemite Grant, giving Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove of giant sequoias to the state of California for public use, resort, and recreation. This was unprecedented. For the first time in human history, a government had set aside land specifically to prevent its commercial destruction. 8 years later, in 1872, Congress established Yellowstone as the first national park. The idea that certain landscapes were too valuable to be sold or developed had entered the American political consciousness. And while the direct line from the Discovery Tree to Yellowstone is complicated by other factors and other advocates, the connection is real. The destruction of that tree helped create the conditions for its distant relatives to be saved. Today, giant sequoias are among the most protected trees on Earth. The groves that survive are mostly inside national parks and monuments. Cutting a giant sequoia is a federal crime, and when wildfires threaten the remaining giants, firefighters wrap their trunks in fire-resistant blankets and spray them with water, treating individual trees as treasures worth defending. The numbers tell the story of what we nearly lost and what we managed to save. Before European contact, there were roughly 75 sequoia groves containing an estimated 30,000 giant specimens over 10 feet in diameter. By 1900, after 50 years of logging and fire, that number had dropped by perhaps a third. Today, thanks to a century of protection, the population has stabilized, though climate change and increasingly severe wildfires present new threats that the men of 1853 could never have imagined. The General Sherman tree, currently the largest tree in the world by volume, stands in Sequoia National Park, where it has been measured, studied, and protected for over a century. It's slightly smaller in diameter than the Discovery Tree was, but taller, and by volume, it may be comparable. Nobody knows for certain which tree was larger. The Discovery Tree was never measured with modern precision. Its dimensions were estimated by men using rope and basic geometry, not the laser scanning and computer modeling that scientists use today. What we do know is that the General Sherman is still alive, still growing, still adding rings to its trunk every year. And the Discovery Tree is gone. The Calaveras Grove is now a state park. The stump of the Discovery Tree is still there, a flat circle of ancient wood slowly decaying into the forest floor. Visitors can stand on it, as those dancing couples did in 1854, and contemplate what's beneath their feet. The mother of the forest is still there too, or what's left of her. The stripped trunk finally fell in the 1990s. 140 years after the bark was removed. Her remains lie where they landed, covered in moss and slowly returning to the soil that grew her. And the bark? The sections that were shipped to London and New York and exhibited across 2 continents? Most of it was destroyed in the Crystal Palace fire. What little survives is scattered across a few museums, fragments of a tree that was once the largest living thing on Earth. There's a lesson in this story, though it's not a comfortable one. We didn't save the Discovery Tree. We couldn't, or we wouldn't, or we simply didn't think to ask whether saving it was possible. The men who cut it down have been dead for over a century. The entrepreneurs who exhibited its remains have been forgotten. The dancing couples are gone. The grove survives. And maybe that's the point. The Discovery Tree died so that its children could live. The destruction became the argument for protection. The outrage that followed the felling, slow building, and eventually overwhelming, created the political conditions that led to Yellowstone and Yosemite and every protected wilderness that came after. That's not a happy ending exactly. It's more like a transaction. We paid for our national parks with the body of the largest tree ever recorded. We learned the value of preservation by watching destruction, and we built our conservation laws on the stump of something we'd already lost. The largest tree ever cut down by human hands has been gone for over 170 years now. But its stump is still there in the Calaveras Grove, slowly returning to the earth. Every year, thousands of visitors come to see it. They stand on the surface where 32 couples once danced. They look up at the trees that surround the clearing, still massive, still ancient, still growing ring by ring toward futures they'll never see. If you go there, if you stand on that stump and look at the cathedral of green rising around you, you might feel something you can't quite name. That feeling is history. It's the weight of choices made by people who've been dead for generations. in choices that determined what would survive and what would be lost. The discovery tree taught us that some things are worth more than money. It cost us everything to learn that lesson. But we learned. And the trees are still there, waiting to see what we do next.